Welcome everybody to this webinar. I see that the number of participants is steadily growing, so welcome all. This is a webinar about the GSJ Best Paper Prize for 2020. This is the big prize of the journal. It's an award that goes to the article, to an article that has stood the test of time. In order to be eligible for the prize, the article must have been published 5 years or more earlier, and that means that the articles have already had some impact on research and teaching and practice. This is the 4th time we hand out the award. And as you can see, there are household names that have been previous winners: Madhur Kayani, Jean-François Nard, and Govindarajan and Ramamurthy, which either means that you really need to be fantastically good to win the prize, or that the prize is a very good platform, a springboard to even greater fame. The winners of this year are into something really big in the future. Alvaro, you have to unmute.
Thank you. What I'd like to share with everybody is the process. This is a long process. It's difficult to find the best paper. So what we do is first we ask all the members of the editorial review board for their nominations. So out of the 100+ people that we have in the board, receive their nominations, and then we basically evaluate them. We try to get metrics of the impact of those papers. Numbers of citations is one of them, relative importance, the topic, and then what we do is basically analyze the top 10 of those articles. We go through a long process between the 3 co-editors and the area editors. So we end up with 9 people providing evaluations for all the papers. We have some ranking of the papers, and then we compile all those numbers, and we end up selecting one of them. And this is the outcome of this process is in general a paper that all of us think that yes, it is something that has had an impact and something that is going to continue having an impact in the future. So that's the case of the 3 papers that won the award before. And this is also the case of this year's winner. So now Ram is going to introduce it.
Thank you, Gabriel and Alvaro. This is not about the editor. This is about the paper and the authors. And so I'm going to be equally brief as my colleagues. This is a very important paper. Gert Hofstede, and I think perhaps it is fair to say, numerous Dutch researchers have highlighted the critical importance of culture in global strategy and international business for the last half-century and more. It is probably fair to say that this particular stream of research is the most important study of culture that affects our discipline. One of the key issues that this paper grapples with is the fact that the Hofstede original work was based on data that was collected in the 1960s and 1970s. And researchers have been utilizing these dimensions virtually unchanged in the decades following. It is a very good question to ask as to whether this research is based upon solid foundations or not. And this is what these authors do. They basically address the question as to whether these scores, the Hofstede scores, are stable over time. And in one sentence, and of course the authors will give us a much greater detail of this, the authors are able to assure us that the relative rankings of the Hofstede scores have remained quite robust. And so it is, we can sort of say, with a great deal of relief that this enormous body of research that we have undertaken over the last 30, 40 years and more is still valid. Thank you very much, Andre, Robert, and Sjoerd. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the honor of doing this webinar, and thank you for selecting us for this prestigious award. We are really happy about it. So I would like to join the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our paper and about the main ideas behind it. I think Ram did an excellent job summarizing it already, so I could keep it really brief, but I'll go through the presentation. So what is this paper about? What is the main idea? The main problem that we address in this paper is this, right? So when Hofstede measured values, the world looked very different from the world today. So in the year that Hofstede measured values, Yoko Ono and John Lennon were still all in bed-ins. Belgium did not even have driver's license back then. The Soviet Union still existed, and perhaps most importantly, none of the authors of this paper were even born yet. So the world was a very, very different place. And many people have noticed this over the year, and many people have argued that simply because of the reason that these Hofstede measures were, these Hofstede values were measured so long ago, they were no longer useful, and they should be outdated, and they should no longer be used. And this criticism has been leveled against using Hofstede measures repeatedly, and in our opinion also a little bit gratuitously. So it's a very easy critique, and this is what we wanted to address in our paper. Is there anything to this critique? So the key issue here is that culture is a key construct in global strategy, and Hofstede measures are the most common, the dominant way of measuring culture. The question is this a good measure or is it outdated? And the idea here in our paper is that what we do is we simply compare the values of the generation that existed, the generation that answered Hofstede survey, to generations after that. And by doing so, we can see whether there is cultural change and whether this cultural change is strong enough and problematic enough as the right shape to make Hofstede's values outdated. And that's the key question. So what are the arguments for cultural change and for cultural stability? So what are the arguments that culture might be stable and that culture would not change? Well, the key argument here is one that Hofstede also uses, is that cultural dimensions, they're not just random collection of values. No, they reflect answers to fundamental questions about how to organize societies. So if you want to be a society, if you want to organize as a society, you need to answer questions like, how do you organize cooperation? Do you do that from top down, or do you give everyone a say? How do you construct the relation between community and individual members? How do you deal with uncertainty? These are key questions that any society needs to answer in their organization. And the scores that Hofstede has identified, the dimensions that Hofstede has identified, they correspond to these key questions. And that means that the scores reflect society's answers to such questions and are deeply embedded in the institutional structures of societies. So they're not just things that people happen to value at the at a certain moment in time. No, they're deeply embedded in how societies are organized and what societies are. So that's the main argument. And what you see then is that cultural values are transmitted from one generation to the next. Why? Because parents, when they raise their children, they want typically to raise their children as good people. But their definition of good people is informed by their values. So if you raise your children as good people, then you also transmitting your own values to your offspring. So parents typically transmit their own values to their offspring. There's also a more collective action issue here in parental transmission, which is that parents do not only look at what they think is right when raising their children, but they also look at what kind of values, what kind of ideas can I give to my children that make it plausible that my children will be successful in this society. So they won't only look at their own values, but will also look at the dominant values in society. And these, and it will have a tendency to transmit these values to their children. So both these mechanisms result in the degree of path dependence and cultural stability. So there are actually good arguments why you might believe that culture might be stable. But that's not the entire story. There are also good arguments why you might believe that culture might change. So what are these? Well, one of the main arguments here is modernization theory that originates with Karl Marx, perhaps, and then has evolved over the past 2 centuries. The main idea here is that all societies evolve on a uniform path. So all societies take the same evolutionary path towards development, and that is not just about economic development, but it also brings changes in society, in societal organization, and also brings changes in values. For example, as Engelhardt has emphasized, with economic development starts a process in which people put less emphasis on material security, on collective needs, and put more emphasis on individual self-expression. So what does this theory tell us about value change? This theory tells us that there will be predictable absolute cultural change, but this change will occur largely along parallel paths, right? So the relative cultural change between societies will only change in proportion to economic convergence and divergence. So if all societies experience the same level of economic growth, then the value change will be exactly on parallel paths, and the differences will be stable. Another argument why cultures might change is what you might call hegemonization. And here the idea is that cultural values of a society are influenced by the most powerful, successful societies in the world. Why? Because there might be normative isomorphic pressures. So in the sense that Americanization, for example, as a specific example of this kind of theory, Americanization might mean that the United States is such a dominant influence in the global economy that it is able to define what professional conduct in business is. And that means that everyone in the world who wants to be a professional businessman will adapt to American standards of professional conduct. And this means that behaviors, cognitions, and values will gradually move in the direction of the United States. Media bias, the Hollywood effect, also plays a strong role. So what does this set of arguments tell us about cultural change? It means that you will expect absolute cultural change of all but the leading economies. So America won't necessarily change, but all other societies will change in the direction of America. And there will be relative cultural convergence, but crucially with constant correlations for all but the leading economies, right? So the differences between all economies except America will remain more or less constant. Or the distribution of the differences will remain constant. The final argument why cultures might change that we addressed in our paper is globalization. Here the idea is simple. Values evolve in relation to the community one interacts with. And that means that cultural divergence is a result of limited contact between communities. This is most obvious in language, right? So the theory is that 50,000 years ago, everyone in the world, all humans in the world, spoke a single proto-language. When humanity dispersed over the world and scattered into distinct communities that lost contact with each other, these languages evolved in different directions and they became separate languages. Now, if you bring all these different communities back together again, and if they regain contact with each other, that reverses this process. So what globalization does is that it brings again back interaction with the wider group, and that means that you get convergence again. These differences, this divergence is stopped and is reversed, and what you expect is value convergence. Now, what does this kind of theory mean? Again, it means that there will be absolute cultural change, but there will be also relative cultural convergence, but again, with constant correlations. So all in all, theoretically, there's ample reason to expect that cultures will have changed since Hofstede did his research. But at the same time, there is all these theories do not provide strong arguments why the distribution of the variation would actually have changed. The question is, what does the empirics tell? And for that, I would like to give the floor to Andre.
You're muted.
Yes, thanks. It's working now. So bear with us so far, because when it comes to empirics, we actually want to make the story that we're telling as relevant as possible for global strategy. And that means that in the end, we don't only check what has been happening to the national culture scores, so the kind of data that you would get in your Excel file or in your data file. You can download it from Hofstede's website in case you haven't done so already. That we're also going to check distances, so these really large-scale matrix of cross-country distances. But it starts with the data that allows us to make a comparison between cohorts. So to be sure, the theories that Robbert has been introducing, they've been around for a long time. And actually, longitudinal data on people's values and beliefs have also been around for quite some time. So there's not really an innovation there. It's the idea to replicate Hofstede using these existing data and being informed by these existing theoretical perspectives. So that's what we try to do. And you never know where inspiration comes from, but Hofstede himself, in his latest edition, so his 2010 book, started using data from the World Value Survey and the European Value Study. So specifically, he had new data that he used to estimate an alternative measure of long-term orientation. So earlier his work, actually long-term orientation didn't cover that many countries, and he addressed this in the 2010 book using data from the World Value Survey and European Value Study. And then, perhaps a little bit presumptuous, we thought, well, if Hofstede is allowed to use these data, then we would also be allowed in a way to use these data. And then the power of the World Value Survey and the European Value Study starts to kick in the sense that you do not only have many countries, but you also have data gathered at different points in time, meaning that you also have data comprising people born in different years. So we can really start to establish birth cohorts. And to be sure, the earliest data is 1981, and some countries have been measured about 5 times since 1981. Other countries maybe only once or twice. So it's not a really nice, clean panel data, but definitely there's sufficient information to say, oh, we know roughly the cohort that Hofstede was studying. And of course, we cannot blame him for not having longitudinal data. But if we can replicate Hofstede using data that Hofstede in his most recent work was using as well, we can basically construct 2 cohorts and check the differences between these cohorts. And the last part here is a little bit cryptic, but the nature of national cultural differences, that there can be changes in the absolute scores, and for a country considered in isolation, but also countries relative to each other. And as an added layer, if countries' culture scores change, what does this mean for all the inter-country cultural distances that we would be able to calculate? So that's really the intuition. I do think that the picture of Lennon and Yoko Ono really tells the story, right? That we want to find a matching cohort that didn't experience all these major life events. So Lennon was alive in this period, so roughly the time of data collection, men on the moon. You had the student riots in France, all these life events that I, as the younger generation, think really helped shape a particular generation. We're going to look at recent generations. So for people born after 1973, of course, 9/11 would have been a major event that has occurred for this particular group of people. So why cohorts? This is actually an application of the previous theory, particularly Engelhardt, a political scientist, is very clear about, let's say, the possibility of observing changing culture scores of countries, so really at the level of society as a whole. But at the same time, there seems to be a tension, because if values are so stable, because of this intergenerational transmission mechanism, then how can we observe changes at the societal level? Well, the mechanism is cohort replacement. So the story is that you have intergenerational transmission between the older cohort towards the younger cohort, but it's not perfect. Cohorts, their values will also be shaped by their specific experiences, including their level of material wealth. And that means that there's a new cohort growing up in society that will have slightly different values than the preceding cohort. And if you start calculating culture scores, as soon as the old cohort dies, no way to sugarcoat this, they are replaced by the younger cohort, you can see that even when values are stable over people's lives, you can see change in culture scores at the societal level. So that's the underlying mechanism why we thought, okay, hey, we have the data, we should look at cohorts if we want to say something about how cultures have been evolving since the time of Hofstede's original data collection. So this is what we found in a verbal description, and I think Ram made a very nice description, because the most important finding for global strategy involves the ranking of countries. Because we can, so that's where we start, we did some psychometric analyses, we can replicate Hofstede. Of course, we're not going to get perfect correlations between the dimensions that we constructed and Hofstede's original dimensions, but we have face validity and we have reasonably high correlations. Also, observing, once we have established that we can in fact do this with a reasonable margin of error, we can start comparing the 2 cohorts. Observing changes or differences between cohorts suggesting changing culture scores. So on average, and I'll show you the data in a minute, but higher absolute scores on individualism and uncertainty avoidance and indulgence versus restraint, and lower scores on power distance. Just so you may remember, Hofstede, his original data collection, he put the scores on a scale from 0 to 100, and we actually applied the same scale, but then saw some countries are actually going to overshoot, and they're going to move beyond the 100 maximum score. And this is, I think, the most interesting feature of the empirical results, that observing all these dynamics, we do see changes in cultural distances between the countries. So that there is, in that sense, cohort variation, or even, if you will, intertemporal variation. But the ultimate point, that is the relative position of countries vis-à-vis each other, and therefore the cultural distances between countries, they may have changed in an absolute sense. But if we correlate it, and we did this, or actually Sjoerd did this nitty-gritty work, we calculated the cultural distance scores for the old cohort. So you get enormous observations, right? It becomes a matrix, so it's squared. You have all these data points for the first cohort, the older cohort, and then the younger cohort, and we can just check the correlation. And that's what actually we thought was most interesting, because this correlation is really high. So if you continue using Hofstede, you are using measures that are not necessarily entirely correct in describing the current situation in a particular country, at the current level of individualism. But across countries, you see that Hofstede's old scores can predict the current scores of societies, and for global strategy, particularly interesting, they actually give a pretty powerful predictor of the current cultural distances between countries. So you can, in that sense, still use Hofstede. I'm actually getting a little bit ahead of the story in terms of conclusion, but just for illustration. So the main table from the paper is this one. You see the number of countries, so that's a nice feature as well. It's such a rich database that you have quite a few countries. And panel A is just the absolute scores, as you would perhaps originally download them from Hofstede's website. Cohort 1, let's take the example of individualism, and that individualism has increased a bit. So the absolute score on individualism has changed. Here you see the summary for the 4 dimensions. To be sure, 6 dimensions nowadays in Hofstede. We were unable to replicate the masculinity-femininity dimension. And the long-term orientation dimension, and this is a little bit ironic. So Hofstede used the same data that we use to measure long-term orientation. But if you check the internal consistency, this dimension really doesn't make that much sense. So it combines 3 items that do not really have face validity and definitely have a very low Cronbach alpha. So that's why we excluded them. Cultural distance. So you see the matrix, you see the number of observations. And we did see a change, so that on individualism, actually, cultural distances were increasing. But at the same time, if you had to use Hofstede to make an assessment of cultural distances between countries as they exist today, then Hofstede data gives you a pretty good predictor. And so the correlations for the younger cohort compared to the scores that you obtain using the older cohort are pretty strong. And so yes, there's a lot of change going on, but in terms of cultural distance, these old data can still be used. So that's bringing us to the relevance and implications. So we know theories of cultural change. So Hofstede was in his works willing to admit that individualism might change, but for some other dimensions, I think he has this a line saying it's like a phoenix, culture always arises and it's stable for millennia, like climate. Well, climate turns out not to be that stable either, but that's another story. Well, ultimately, given the change that we observe, okay, we see changes in absolute culture scores. So you want to be a little bit careful there. But the relative interpretations, the kind of interpretations that we are most commonly making in global strategy, which is a little bit the distinction between cultural profile effects and cultural distance effects. For cultural distance, Hofstede still useful. So I think it's still useful, obviously, for theorizing, for thinking about dimensions, for thinking, as Robbert emphasized, these fundamental questions that societies have to answer if they are to work and live together. But bottom line, for cultural distance, you want to use Hofstede if possible. Of course, use our data, use globe data, but don't think that your analysis is going to be incorrect or systematically biased because you are using older data. So that's it. I think for discussion, we can say, and Sjoerd can join us, so some general thoughts for future, but I think maybe some Q&A first is better. So thanks for your attention so far.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I think we, the editors, might kick off with some questions, and then we might take some questions from the floor. Gabriel, would you like to go first, and then Alvaro?
Thank you, Ram, and thank you, Robbert, Andre, and Sjoerd, for a very nice presentation. We actually have one question from the participants, Mamik. So let's start with that before we steal the show. Was there any difference in change in power distance in between developed and developing countries, and also between socialist and democracies?
So short answer, we didn't check. So I like the idea, and I'm expecting to see some differences, but no, we didn't check. So in that sense, our paper was really more descriptive, finding out what was happening rather than really focusing on possible country heterogeneity. But you would expect maybe, let's say, change to have been more almost like radical in post-communist transition countries, for instance. Yeah, I can see definitely that there can be such heterogeneity. Yeah, so interesting idea.
If I can add to that, Mani, I think that's an excellent question. What we did observe in some follow-up research, but that never saw daylight in a published version, is that countries in which economic growth has been fairly high, you see that power distance also tends to change more relative to countries in which economic growth has been lagging. And this fits perfectly with what Robbert was explaining in his theoretical explanation, is that power distance, especially power distance, and the role of hierarchy and the acceptance of hierarchy has gone down in richer countries. So if I always tell the story to my students in terms of when my grandfather and my father, my grandfather complained about my father for not accepting hierarchy. My father complained about me, and I'm again complaining about my children in terms of not accepting hierarchy. So there seems to be some consistency here, and it partly has to do with the difference in material wealth, and thus the difference between developed and developing countries.
Well, if no one has any question, I would like to ask a question, and which goes to your results. I think so finding that there is change, cultural change, is probably not sort of a very surprising finding. But what is really surprising in what you find is the lack of convergence over time in cultures, so that the relative distance between countries as they evolve seems to be sort of, keeping in pace, and that goes quite a lot of against the idea globalization and the effect of globalization on cultural change and what follows with it, and demand patterns and so forth. And I would like to know sort of what are your reflections on this, and how do you explain this? So is the idea of the hegemon and the hegemonization theory just sort of hot air and little substance, or is it that the period that you cover has had too many sort of, or the idea of hegemon has not been crystal clear in that period, so you don't find a clear effect? So what is really driving this? Any ideas about that? And you have to unmute if you want to.
This is one for you.
That's a good question. So I think one of the motivations for a paper, as I explained, was that we felt that this critique leveled against Hofstede, that it was very likely that cultural change would have taken place, and therefore the framework is outdated. We always thought that was too easy. And actually, the theoretical argument that we make, what we explain here, is that even though it's very likely that you have cultural change over time, most of the theories that predict this cultural change do so in a way that also predicts more or less sort of a constant distribution of the variation, right? So globalization theory argues, yes, there will be cultural change, but the distribution of the variation will be more or less constant. Modernization theory does the same. Hegemonization arguments a little bit less, but mostly also. So even though there will be cultural change, it's quite likely that and actually we've shown that there is cultural change, our results actually fit these theoretical frameworks in the sense that they show there is cultural change, but the distribution of the variation is not affected strongly. Does that answer your question?
To some extent, yes. Although sometimes it's fun to create a little bit more of a horse race between theories. So you could say that a little bit simplistically that the idea of the hegemon driving cultural change would actually predict some degree of convergence over time. So in that sense, your results are perhaps more unexpected than at least one interpretation of that theory at large would suggest. That would be sort of my, but perhaps I have a penchant for horse races in theory testing. I don't know. Yeah.
But I do agree with you, and I think especially the horse racing becomes interesting if you start theorizing about specific dimensions.
I'm not sure. Sjoerd, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think actually what
Andre, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, for instance, Hofstede was willing to admit cultural change and individualism because he saw a very clear link between material circumstances and individualism, which can be as simple as if you're poor, you have many generations living under the same roof. If you're richer, you have enough money to get your own place and live separate from your parents. So those kind of ideas. So I do think horse races per dimension could be quite insightful to see which dimensions are affected by which mechanisms. And another perspective, I think, so if you look at more the people focusing on identity, there can also be a backlash, in the sense that if you feel things around you are changing, that you start focusing on your own culture more and try to separate yourself, distinguish yourself more. So we know the slow food movement, which is partly a response to globalization. So people may actually turn more inwards and in a way start attaching more value to cultural identity and really go through efforts in a way to distinguish themselves from other cultures. So it could also work in that sense the other way. But that's the annoying part of all these theories, that there's a lot of possibilities.
I think I would like to throw in an additional element that Gabriel was touching upon implicitly. I think the idea of the hegemon, many people have in mind then the US. And so it's the media effect that Robert was alluding to. It's but what all the data on the US compared to other countries tell you is that the US, relative to its level of economic development, is fairly collectivist, is fairly traditional. And one element of this has been the role of religion, which compared to Northern European countries especially, where secularization has been much stronger than in the US. On average, we know that the US consists of different parts, especially nowadays, but this is something that I think has shaped the discussion about the hegemon a lot, that economic power of the US, let's say since the Second World War, should not be confused with the idea that that's the normative or the ideal cultural model that other countries would be converging to. So all the data, if you start digging into the role of the church, the role of religion, but also the relevance of social capital, those kinds of communitarian, I'm purposely not using the word communist here, but you know what I'm trying to say is that this has been, I think, generally underestimated how important these kinds of things are in the US compared to some other countries with similar levels of economic development. So the idea of the US as being the ultimate outcome to which other countries would converge, I think is also, at least in the data that we have looked at, is something that we don't see. It's just not there.
Could I follow up on that? Follow up on actually something, Sjoerd, you said about your grandfather, your father, and yourself and your children relative to the role of hierarchy. That immediately called up in my mind some kind of notion of entropy, right? It's ultimately increasing disorder. So ultimately you have hierarchy, you have order, and kind of a very old-fashioned sense, kind of a Locke versus Hobbes kind of view, Leviathan, and so on. And we have a very powerful hierarchy, very great centralization, empires, 19th century, for example, and then we have this slow unraveling over time. We also know from history, so we're all students of history, that over the last, empires rise, civilizations, empires rise and they fall. And one aspect of fall is indeed a rise of entropy, right? So basically, as you have increasing disorder, you have also a movement towards collapse. There's so many threads in your findings that all tie together, it seems like, and create sort of a bit of a nice mosaic. If you also look at, for example, the tension between indulgence versus restraint, and the tension between individualism versus hierarchy. Now, in your own work, Sjoerd, and I think with some of your other co-authors, you've studied the differences in entrepreneurship across locations. And of course, that may also be correlated with increases in individualism, right? And also increases lack of hierarchy. As we get trace, for example, the nature of the modern multinational towards an increasingly less hierarchic, more reliance on network type systems and more reliance on external entrepreneurship over time. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there's kind of, if you could comment on your results with regard to some kind of a, what I always think of as basically the universal truth of inverted U, everything is an inverted U shape, eventually. So we have like the good, right? As we reduce hierarchy, we get more entrepreneurship, more innovation, all this good stuff, but we also get increasing disorder. And we also get increasing indulgence, where people sort of consume instead of save, and so on. And so if you could just sort of comment on that in terms of maybe, where do you see this going in terms of societies? Are we looking at, for example, are we in Rome 450, right? So 20 years before the collapse. Or are we looking at some kind of a Paul Romer type world where increasing returns are going to kick in? We're going to see this tremendous, we're going to go to the stars in 100 years. Ultimately, firms are going to create wealth. That's going to be the driver, right?
I've been, just the other week I was discussing this topic with Robbert, and the key word that we both used was the word identity. So what happens, at least that was our ideas when we were discussing exactly this, is that what happens when power distance goes down, when individualism goes up, when indulgence becomes more important, what doesn't go away is the need for people to be part of a community, a sense of community. So any society needs a certain degree of being part of we. Now the question is, how do you define we? So who is part of the we as you define it? And if levels of individualism are very high in Western countries, if power distance levels are relatively low, if indulgence levels are high, but the demand for feeling part of a community is still high, then people start looking for their own groups and identify with new groups on the basis of that. I think that is partly an explanation for why the role of identity has become so incredibly relevant in many Western countries, not just the US. I mean, the US, I think it's turbocharged because of a two-party system, which makes it politically very relevant. But in other Western countries, it's been the same discussion. Also in Northern European countries, it has become much more a discussion about identity, identification, and feeling a part of a group that you define yourself in an era of individualist behavior. So I think the key word in my response to your question would be identity and identification.
But can I just take this in a slightly more global strategy direction, and then I will close. That would seem to mesh well with the strategies of firms like Apple, global strategies of firms like Apple, which basically build themselves this whole I world of trying to define yourself as part of my world, right? So I'm an Apple person, and trying to give you, your corporations are trying to get you to utilize them as part of your identity, right? So and this transcends borders. So it becomes very
absolutely. This transcends borders, but it's also something that you can see if you talk to people working in HR departments, and if you ask them questions about how they were used to deal with, let's say, few generations ago, or the youngest generation, so trainees who come in and become part of this large multinational firm, then it's really changed how you manage those trainees, and the idea that the need to give them the idea to be part of a community instead of hierarchically from the top saying that they should do something or ought to do something has changed radically compared to let's say 30, 40 years ago. So it's even at the level of, for example, HR policies in large multinational firms that you see both the shift in cultural values and the need for firms to take that into account when they want to mobilize their workers.
I'd like
also
to
recognize the network effects of identity, because Apple partly it becomes valuable because of its identity, and the identity involves the people. So you get a lot of co-creation in these network type of firms where the brand and the community that they create is actually part of the value. I mean, briefly, WhatsApp became less valuable because people were switching to Telegram. and nothing happened to the functionality. It's just the network effect. So in creating an identity, yeah, you can become, if successful, of course, very influential in that sense. I do want to say that for me personally, identity is just that it's taking a different form, because not that long ago, Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in Ireland, right? So I think identity has always been there, and it has been the source of much conflict. It's just that we're now seeing different manifestations because the need for identity and community is there. It's just that the old forms by which we used to categorize people and recognize our own social identity and those of others are changing. And in that sense, there's a vacuum that is being filled, for instance, by global brands.
I'd like to maybe redirect the conversation to another topic. I'd like to hear your view of the relationship between culture and institutions, and especially in research, and this is a perception. It used to be integrated. Everybody more or less saw them as being part of the same story, and to some extent they seem to have diverged. And there are cultural researchers and institution researchers, and there is, to some extent, I don't know, little conversation among them, and especially on the institutional side, and some conversations I have had, they don't see culture anymore as part of the institutions. Personally, I find it surprising. What's your view of this?
Robbert, you want to take this one?
Yeah, if my connection holds. I agree. I share your surprise. So I think culture is part of the institutional framework. So the way I see it is that institutions are about rules, right? They're about the rules through which we organize society. And these rules, they can be enforced in different ways. You can enforce them by state coercion. And you can also enforce them by peer pressure, by societal pressure. And you can also enforce them by internalization. And so people automatically do them without even thinking about it. Now, if you think about the latter two mechanisms, you're thinking about culture, you're thinking about cultural effects. But it's the same rules, right? It's the same basic principle. These are all rules organizing society. So it's just, I think I see culture more as a different manifestation of the same institutions that you can also see in laws and formal regulations. So that's the way I look at it. Of course, why have these things separated intellectually? I think that's just the story of specialization that harms social science in general, right? So we keep dividing up into separate disciplines, and we're not talking too much to each other anymore. And I think that's what's the problem here.
We have one additional question from the audience that perhaps some of you want to answer. Shall I read it out loud? Any impact of change due to population or ethnic cultural homogeneity, in brackets, Japan, or heterogeneity, diversity on level of change?
I think that's a good question. I think it ties in with your earlier remark of what exactly we're seeing and which theories are dominant. So I think you emphasized the surprise for a lack of a convergence. Cultural values are collective traits, so we also measure them at the level of societies, but this means we're missing a lot of heterogeneity. So what you could have is, for instance, due to changing ethnic composition, that in a way the distribution of values in societies grow broader. But this wouldn't affect the mean score. So we wouldn't be picking this up if we calculate the culture scores. But these kind of changes can definitely be happening in society. So that if you look at individual values and beliefs, that's the heterogeneity within societies can be increasing quite a bit. Yeah. So I think that's more or less what this question was aiming at. But there's definitely interesting distinction between levels of analysis.
There's also an intergenerational aspect here. So there's lots of work on ethnic entrepreneurship, and in this specifically in the field of entrepreneurship, people have been looking at migrant entrepreneurship. So this is not just in the field of strategy, but it's especially in sociology where there's been lots of work on migrant entrepreneurship and the role of migrant communities in this. And because of increasing data availability, large-scale secondary data, including data from the US Census, it's possible to trace back, to connect a migrant entrepreneur's sets of values to the country of origin where the parents come from. So you see more and more research trying to get closer to the intergenerational transmission. And then migrants are an interesting group of people because migrants themselves were raised and socialized in their formative years in another country. And the children of migrants were raised by parents who were socialized in another country. Now, how does that affect people's decision making? How does that affect the decision to become an entrepreneur or to not become an entrepreneur? Now, I'm mentioning entrepreneurship, you can generalize it, but especially in the field of entrepreneurship, it's these kinds of questions that have been popping up. So the underlying diversity within societies is for sure explored, including with large secondary data because of increasing data availability, and trying to get closer to this notion of how do values actually get transferred from one generation to the next.
I think thank you for that. I think we are nearing the end of this webinar, very quickly approaching the 1 hour mark. So if nobody wants to add anything to what has been, I think, a very interesting discussion and also presentation of what is, I think, a great paper. I'm sure that we have just seen sort of the beginning of its career in both in the journal, but also will make ripples well beyond the global strategy community into strategy at large, and definitely international business, and hopefully the other social sciences. And of course, with such a distinguished set of authors, who are very well placed to communicate beyond sort of the business scholars communities. I think the ideas in the paper and its results are into a very, very bright future indeed. So many thanks to the presenters, to the attendees, and
I'd just like to
happy holiday seasons, everybody. And then Ram will say something to the end.
Before Ram says something, I would like to thank, on behalf of Andre and Robert and myself, I would like to thank Alvaro, Gabriel and Ram for organizing this, but also for the responsibility of awarding us this wonderful prize. So thank you for that.